The siege of Kobanî was launched by the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant militants on 13 September 2014, in order to capture the Kobanî canton and its main city of Kobanî in northern Syria, in the de facto autonomous region of Rojava. By the 2nd of October 2014, ISIL succeeded in capturing 350 Kurdish villages and towns within the vicinity of Kobanî, generating a wave of some 300,000 displaced Kurds, who fled across the border into Turkey's Şanlıurfa province. By January 2015, this had risen to 400,000. The Kurdish People's Protection Units, coordinated as part of the Euphrates Volcano Joint Operations Room, were later joined by further Free Syrian Army reinforcements, heavily armed Peshmerga of the Kurdistan Regional Government, and American and Arab airstrikes providing air support. On 26 January 2015, the YPG, along with the FSA and Peshmerga reinforcements and the continued US-led airstrikes, began to retake the city, driving ISIL into a steady retreat. The city of Kobanî was fully recaptured on 27 January, however, most of the remaining villages in the Kobanî canton remained under ISIL control. Kurdish militia along with allied Arab armed groups backed by further airstrikes, then made rapid advances in rural Kobanî, with ISIL withdrawing 25 kilometers from the city of Kobanî by the 2nd of February. By late April 2015, ISIL had lost almost all of the villages it had captured in the canton, but maintained control of a few dozen villages it seized in the northwestern part of the Agathocle Governorate. In late June 2015, ISIL launched a new offensive against the city, killing at least 233 civilians. Background: during the Syrian civil war, the People's Protection Units took over Kobanî on 19 July 2012. Since July 2012, the city has been under Kurdish control, while the YPG and Kurdish politicians exercise autonomy for the area they consider part of Syrian Kurdistan. On 2 July 2014, the city and the surrounding villages came under attack from fighters of the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant. ISIL advance. On 13 September 2014, ISIL launched a massive offensive to take the Kobanî canton and the city of Kobanî, pushing into the villages at the western and eastern borders of the canton. On 17 September 2014, following the capture of a strategic bridge over the Euphrates on 16 September, ISIL launched a large offensive using tanks, rockets and artillery in the direction of Kobanî, and within 24 hours, captured 21 Kurdish inhabited villages. The advance left Kobanî encircled by ISIL forces, and it also forced the remaining Free Syrian Army fighters to the southwest of the Kobanî canton to retreat to the city of Kobanî. 2 days later, ISIL captured 39 more villages, bringing their forces within 20 kilometers of Kobanî. 45,000 refugees crossed into Turkey, fearing an ISIL takeover of the region, while a number of refugees were stopped at the border and ordered to return to Kobanî by Turkish authorities. The inhabitants of 100 villages were evacuated after coming under continuous shelling, and dozens of civilians and YPG fighters were killed as the ISIL advance continued. On 20 September, ISIL forces came within 15 kilometers of the city of Kobanî after capturing 3 more villages, and started bombarding areas within 10 kilometers of the city. Meanwhile, more than 300 Kurdish fighters reached Kobanî from Turkey as reinforcements. Senior Kurdistan Workers' Party official Murat Karayalan appealed to Kurdish youth in Turkey to join Kurdish forces in Syria. During the day, 3 rockets exploded within Kobanî, spreading fear among its inhabitants. Since the start of the offensive, 34 civilians had been killed, while the number of refugees had reached 60,000. By the 21st of September, ISIL militants captured 64 villages, 39 ISIL and 27 Kurdish fighters had been killed in the previous 48 hours. Kurdish forces evacuated at least 100 villages on the Syrian side after ISIL militants began their offensive against the Kurdish villages. ISIL troops came within 10 kilometers of the city and continued to advance, with the fighting concentrated in the southern and eastern suburbs of Kobanî, 13 kilometers from the city proper. The next day, a Kurdish spokesman reported that the ISIL advance east of the city had been halted during the previous night. Despite the stalled advance, ISIL forces shelled the center of the city, and clashes continued in the vicinity of the village of Mojak and the village of Alicia. On the same day, Turkish Deputy Prime Minister Numan Kurtulmuş said that more than 130,000 Syrian Kurds fled across the border into Turkey, escaping an advance by ISIL jihadists. On the 24th of September, ISIL forces continued their advance south of the city, despite airstrikes against its supply lines by warplanes, which reportedly came from the Turkish side of the border. This brought ISIL within 8 kilometers to the south of Kobanî, the closest they had been to the city since the offensive started on the 13th of September. ISIL had increased its forces in the Kobanî canton to at least 4,000 by this time. During the advance, ISIL forces captured the villages of Robi and Tal Ghazal, and the nearby grain silos. In addition, an ISIL source claimed that their forces had also captured several villages to the west of Kobanî. The front line to the west had moved to the cluster of villages called Sifdik, as more ISIL fighters and tanks arrived for the offensive during the previous day. The next morning, ISIL fighters were only 2 kilometers away, as clashes were continuing. By this point, ISIL controlled 75% of the Kobanî canton, while Kurdish forces only had control of the city of Kobanî, the smaller town of Syracuse, and around 15 villages nearby. On the 26th of September, ISIL troops captured a hill from which YPG fighters had been attacking them in recent days, 10 kilometers west of Kobanî. ISIL also captured a village about 7 kilometers to the east of Kobanî. Coalition airstrikes and Kobanî besieged on the 27th of September. U.S. and Arab coalition planes bombed the area around Kobanî for the first time, targeting ISIL positions in the village of Alicia, 4 kilometers from the city, which was used as a command and control center by ISIL. Despite the coalition airstrikes against frontline ISIL positions, they were still able to begin shelling the city of Kobanî, wounding several people. The reticence to use airstrikes to help the Kurdish city was believed to have been done so to avoid upsetting Turkey. By the 28th of September, 1,500 Kurdish fighters coming from Turkey reinforced the Kurds in Kobanî. The next day, ISIL forces approaching from the south and the southeast came within 5 kilometers of the city, while Kobanî was facing sustained bombardment for a second day. The next day, ISIL troops approaching from the east advanced within 2 to 3 kilometers of Kobanî. During the fighting, the Kurds reportedly destroyed 2 ISIL tanks. ISIL fighters also captured the village of Sifdik, to the west, and used it to stage attacks on Kobanî itself. Additionally, the village of Kazakhan was also captured. This resulted in ISIL troops capturing one of the final villages on the outskirts of Kobanî, and approaching to within 1 kilometer of the town's entrance. At this point, Kurdish fighters in Kobanî were reinforcing their positions with sandbags to prepare for potential house-to-house fighting. By evening, amid a sharp shortage of weapons, Kurdish forces withdrew from the city suburbs, as ISIL forces continued their advance. As ISIL forces entered the suburbs of Kobanî, some refugees reported torture, rape, murder, and mutilation at the hands of ISIL. ISIL militants were reportedly beheading Kurdish fighters, including women. By the 2nd of October, ISIL forces had captured 350 of the 354 villages around Kobanî, and were positioned only hundreds of meters to the south and southeast of the city. Intense firefights had erupted that day, resulting in 57 ISIL deaths in the east of the city, while an Iraqi ISIL commander and 8 other militants were killed in the southern sector. The next day, ISIL militants took control of Kobanî's southern and eastern entrances and exits. They had also taken a strategic hill and a radio tower, which overlooked the town. Later, a Kurdish fighter reported that ISIL militants had entered the city's southwestern fringes, and that fighting was ongoing. The US-led coalition conducted at least 7 air sorties against ISIL targets around Kobanî within 5 days, until the 2nd of October, during which the US performed no strikes on that day, before reportedly carried out further strikes late on the 3rd of October. During the night between 3 and the 4th of October, an ISIL attempt to breach the city was repelled. Coalition airstrikes continued on the 4th of October, targeting ISIL logistics units, artillery positions, and a personnel carrier. By this point, the city was essentially empty, as nearly all residents, except the defenders, fled to Turkey. The last foreign journalist also left on the 4th of October. In all, some 90% of the region's population had evacuated.